When we look at Iran's retaliation, it's tempting to see it as a simple reaction, an emotional or reactive strike in response to being attacked. But that's not how state behavior works at this level. What we're really seeing is something far more deliberate, a calculated response rooted in the logic of deterrence, signaling, and survival. Because for Iran, retaliation is not just about punishment, it's about communication. It's about sending a message to the United States, to Israel, and to the broader international system that certain actions come with consequences. And if those consequences are not imposed, then the credibility of the state itself begins to erode. Like, that's the foundation of this response, credibility. In geopolitics, credibility is not abstract, it's currency. If a state is seen as unwilling or unable to respond to attacks, its deterrence weakens. And once deterrence weakens, the risk of further escalation increases. So retaliation becomes necessary, not because it guarantees victory, but because it preserves the perception of strength. And perception in this context is everything. Now, what makes Iran's approach particularly interesting is the balance it tries to strike between escalation and restraint. Because on one hand, Iran needs to demonstrate that it can respond forcefully, that it has the capability to impose costs. But on the other hand, it does not want to trigger a full-scale war that could threaten regime stability or invite overwhelming retaliation. So what emerges is a strategy of calibrated retaliation, not maximal force, but sufficient force, not indiscriminate escalation, but targeted, purposeful action. This is a pattern we've seen repeatedly in Iran's strategic behavior over time. It is not a state that rushes into all-out war. Instead, it operates in the gray zone, where actions are forceful enough to matter, but controlled enough to avoid crossing certain thresholds. And that requires discipline, because once you choose to respond, you are entering a dynamic process. Your actions will be analyzed, interpreted, and responded to in turn. So every move becomes part of a broader conversation, a strategic dialogue conducted through force. Now, there is another layer to this that's often overlooked: internal signaling. Retaliation is not just about external audiences, it's also about internal ones. For the leadership in Iran, demonstrating strength is essential for maintaining domestic legitimacy. In a system where political authority is closely tied to perceptions of resilience and resistance, failing to respond forcefully can be seen as weakness. And weakness in that context can be politically destabilizing. So retaliation serves multiple purposes at once. It reassures domestic audiences, it reinforces internal cohesion, and it signals to external actors that the state remains intact, capable, and willing to act. And that multi-layered signaling is what makes these decisions so complex, because leaders are not just asking, what is the right military response? When they are asking, what does this response communicate to multiple audiences at once? And those audiences don't always want the same message. Externally, you may want to signal restraint to avoid escalation. Internally, you may need to signal strength to maintain authority. And balancing those two pressures is one of the central challenges of modern statecraft. Now, there's also the question of timing. In retaliation, timing is strategic. A response that is too immediate can be seen as reactive, driven by emotion rather than calculation. A response that is delayed can be seen as weak or indecisive. So the timing of retaliation itself becomes part of the message. And that timing often reflects internal deliberation, signaling that the state is not acting impulsively but thoughtfully. This is important because it shapes how the retaliation is perceived by adversaries. If a response appears controlled and deliberate, it reinforces the idea that the state is capable of measured escalation. If it appears chaotic or impulsive, it may invite further challenges. So again, we see that perception is central, but perhaps the most important aspect of Iran's response is it is designed to keep the door open to escalation, but also open to de-escalation. This is a subtle but critical point. By calibrating its retaliation, Iran avoids committing fully to a path that would make de-escalation impossible. It retains flexibility, it keeps options open, and in doing so, it maintains strategic ambiguity, because in international politics, ambiguity can be a form of power. If your adversaries are uncertain about how far you are willing to go, they must be more cautious. They must consider multiple scenarios, and that caution can slow down escalation. So retaliation becomes not just reaction, but a tool for shaping the future environment. Now, stepping back, what does all of this tell us? It tells us that modern conflict is not just about force. It's about signaling, perception, and control. And retaliation in this context is not a breakdown of order. It is part of the system, a system where actions are carefully calibrated to achieve multiple objectives at once: deterrence, communication, legitimacy, and control. But that system is also fragile. Because once retaliation begins, it can become difficult to stop. Each action invites a response. Each response creates pressure for further action. And before long, what began as controlled retaliation can evolve into a broader conflict. So the challenge for all actors involved is this: how do you maintain control in a system that is inherently designed to escalate? How do you respond firmly enough to preserve credibility, but carefully enough to preserve stability? That is the question at the heart of Iran's response. And it's a question that doesn't have an easy answer, because in a world where perception shapes reality and where credibility shapes power, every decision carries weight far beyond its immediate impact. So as we look at Iran's retaliation, we should not just see missiles and drones. We should see a strategy, a carefully constructed response designed to send a message, preserve balance, and shape the future. And the real question is whether that strategy leads to stability, or whether it sets in motion forces that become increasingly difficult to control. Because once the signal is sent, the system begins to react, and what happens next is no longer entirely in anyone's hands. When Examiner Nasher, we examine Iran's use of missiles and drones, it's easy to focus on the hardware, the speed of a ballistic missile, the range of a drone, the precision of a strike, but that misses the deeper story. Because what we're really looking at is not just capability, it's adaptation. Over the past decade, Iran has invested heavily in developing a military doctrine that does not rely on conventional parity. It doesn't try to outmatch the United States or Israel in traditional force-on-force terms. Instead, it operates on a different principle: asymmetric pressure, and that's where missiles and drones become central. These tools are not just weapons, they are instruments of strategic design, because what makes them powerful is not just their destructive capacity, but their scalability, their accessibility, and their ability to be deployed in large numbers across a wide geographic area. They allow Iran to project force without needing to deploy large ground forces. They allow for distance. And most importantly, they allow for persistence. And persistence changes everything. In a conventional conflict, power is often concentrated. You have decisive engagements, clear fronts, defined outcomes. But in a drone and missile-based strategy, conflict becomes more diffuse. It spreads across time and space. It creates uncertainty, not just in where the next strike will happen, but when. And that uncertainty has a psychological effect. Because when threats are continuous, even if individually limited, they create a constant state of pressure, and that pressure forces adversaries to allocate resources, to stay on alert, to stretch their defenses across multiple points of vulnerability. That's exactly what we see in Iran's response pattern. Rather than concentrating all its force in one decisive strike, Iran distributes its retaliation across multiple vectors. Missiles, drones, and coordinated waves of attacks create a layered offensive strategy that tests air defenses, probes weaknesses, and forces constant recalibration. It's not just about hitting targets, it's about exhausting systems. And that's an important distinction, because modern defense systems are not just physical. They are logistical, technological, and psychological. They rely on prediction, coordination, and rapid response. But when those systems are overwhelmed by sustained pressure, even the most advanced defenses begin to show strain. That's the strategic intent behind saturation tactics. Launch enough incoming threats, and you force your adversary to make difficult choices. Which targets do you prioritize? Which do you let through? How do you allocate limited defensive resources in a situation where threats are arriving from multiple directions? And every choice comes with risk. Now, from Iran's perspective, this approach also serves another purpose: cost imposition. Direct conflict with a major power is extremely costly, but asymmetric retaliation allows a state like Iran to impose costs without entering into full-scale war. It's a way of signaling, we may not match you in conventional strength, but we can still affect your calculations. And in geopolitics, that kind of influence matters, because power is not just about winning wars. It's about shaping behavior. If you can make your adversary reconsider its actions even slightly, you've already achieved part of your objective. So each missile, each drone becomes more than just a strike. It becomes part of a broader effort to influence decision-making. Now, there's also an important geographic dimension to this. Iran's response was not confined to a single front. Instead, it extended across the region, testing defenses and responses in multiple locations simultaneously. That kind of distributed pressure complicates the strategic picture because it forces adversaries to think not just about one battlefield, but about many. And when you have to defend multiple locations at once, your margins for error shrink. This is where regional allies and partners come into play. Countries like Israel and the United States rely on integrated defense systems, intelligence sharing, and coordinated response mechanisms. But when pressure is applied across multiple domains at once, coordination becomes more difficult, and that difficulty is part of the strategy. Because the goal is not just to strike, it's to stretch defensive capabilities, to stretch decision-making processes, to stretch the system to its limits. Now, another layer to this is the use of drones. Drones represent a significant evolution in modern warfare. They are relatively low cost compared to missiles. They can be deployed in large numbers, and they can be used in both surveillance and attack roles. For Iran, drones provide flexibility. They allow for persistent presence in the airspace of adversaries. They can be used to gather intelligence, test defenses, or carry out targeted strikes. And because they are harder to detect and intercept than traditional aircraft, they add another layer of complexity to the defensive equation. But perhaps most importantly, drones introduce a level of unpredictability, because they can be deployed in swarms from multiple directions at varying speeds and altitudes. And that unpredictability forces defenders to constantly adapt. So what we see here is not just a set of weapons, but a system designed to maximize pressure while minimizing exposure, a system that leverages technology, geography, and timing to create a sustained impact, and a system that reflects a broader shift in how conflict is conducted in the modern era. But there is a paradox at the heart of this approach, because while missiles and drones can impose significant pressure, they also risk escalation. Each strike increases the likelihood of a response. Each escalation raises the stakes. And over time, what begins as a controlled pattern of retaliation can evolve into a broader, more dangerous conflict. So once again, we return to the central tension. Control versus escalation. Iran's use of missiles and drones reflects an attempt to navigate that tension, to apply enough pressure to achieve strategic objectives, but not so much pressure that it loses control of the situation entirely. And that balance is incredibly difficult to maintain, because the more you use these tools, the more you normalize their use. And once they become part of the conflict's rhythm, they can be difficult to step back from. So the question becomes not just how these tools are used, but can be used before the dynamics of the conflict change. And that's where we begin to see the limits of strategy, because no matter how well designed a system is, it operates within a larger environment, an environment shaped by reactions, miscalculations, and unintended consequences. And in that environment, even the most carefully calibrated actions can produce outcomes that were never intended. So when we look at Iran's missile and drone strategy, we should not just see tactical innovation. We should see a broader pattern, a way of thinking about conflict that emphasizes pressure, persistence, and control, but also one that exists within a system where control is never guaranteed. And that leads us to a final question. If pressure is used as a tool and if persistence becomes the norm, then at what point does pressure stop being a strategy and start becoming a trigger? Because in the end, that is where the real risk lies, not in the weapons themselves, but in how they reshape the environment in which they are used. When we look at where Iran chose to strike, we begin to see something very deliberate taking shape, because this wasn't just about responding to an attack with force. It was about choosing where that force would be felt and what kind of message those locations would send. For Iran, target selection is never random. It's strategic. And in this case, the strategy appears to extend beyond immediate military retaliation and into something much broader, shaping the regional environment itself. Now, when a state responds to a strike from powers like the United States or Israel, it has to answer a critical question. Do we confine this conflict to the battlefield, or do we expand the pressure into the wider system that supports our adversary? Iran's response suggests the latter. Because instead of limiting retaliation to a single theater, we see a pattern of strikes that extend across multiple geographic and strategic points: energy infrastructure, logistics routes, military installations, and locations tied to regional stability. And that matters, because modern conflict is not just about military targets anymore. It's about systems. It's about energy flows, supply chains, trade routes, economic confidence, the invisible infrastructure that keeps a region functioning. And when those systems are disrupted, even temporarily, the effects ripple outward far beyond the immediate point of impact. So when missiles or drones are directed toward energy infrastructure, for example, the signal is not just we can strike you. It's we can affect your economy. When logistics hubs are targeted, the message becomes we can disrupt your mobility. When strikes occur across multiple countries simultaneously, the message becomes even broader. This conflict is no longer contained. That last point is especially important, because by expanding the geographic scope of its response, Iran is effectively signaling that the consequences of the conflict are regional, not bilateral. This is a critical shift, because once a conflict extends beyond two primary actors, it becomes much harder to control. Now you have multiple stakeholders, multiple governments, multiple military forces, and each one introduces new variables into the system. And in that kind of environment, escalation becomes more difficult to predict. But here's the deeper layer. This kind of strategy also introduces a form of strategic ambiguity, because when multiple locations are affected, it becomes less clear where the next strike will occur. That uncertainty forces adversaries to spread their attention across a wider area. It forces them to prepare for multiple scenarios at once. And that in itself is a form of pressure, because attention is a limited resource. And when you have to defend multiple points simultaneously, you inevitably weaken concentration somewhere else. That's exactly the kind of strain Iran is trying to create. Not necessarily to defeat its adversaries outright, but to complicate their ability to operate efficiently. Now, there's also an important political dimension to this. When a country like Iran extends its response across the region, it's not only sending a message to its primary adversaries, it's also sending a message to neighboring states. Countries like those in the Gulf Cooperation Council, states such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait are suddenly part of the strategic equation, whether they want to be or not. And that changes their position, because now they must consider their own vulnerability, their own infrastructure, their own role in the broader conflict. Do they remain passive observers? Do they reinforce their defenses? Or do they align more closely with one side to reduce their exposure? These are not easy choices. And that's precisely the point, because by spreading the impact of its retaliation across the region, Iran is increasing the number of actors who now have a stake in how this conflict unfolds. And when more actors are involved, the system becomes more complex. And when systems become more complex, control becomes more difficult. Now, from a strategic perspective, this is a way of increasing leverage. Because if multiple countries feel the pressure of potential escalation, they may begin to push for de-escalation. They may begin to apply diplomatic pressure. They may begin to look for ways to contain the conflict before it expands further. And in that sense, regional pressure, pressure becomes a tool. But like all tools, it comes with risks, because once a conflict spreads geographically, it becomes harder to contain, and containment is always the goal. No major power wants a localized conflict to become a regional war. No regional actor wants instability to spread across borders. And yet, by widening the scope of its response, Iran is testing that boundary. It is asking a fundamental question: how far can this conflict go before it triggers a broader response that no one can control? And that question does not have a simple answer, because every additional strike, every new location, every new actor involved adds another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. And complexity in this context is both a strategy and a risk. So what we are seeing is not just retaliation, it is a calculated attempt to reshape the environment in which the conflict exists, to expand the playing field, to introduce new pressures, and to force all actors to reconsider their positions. But there is always a limit, because at a certain point, expansion creates instability, and instability invites reaction, sometimes measured, sometimes unpredictable. And that's where the system becomes dangerous, because once too many variables are in play, control becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. So when we look at Iran's pattern of targeting, we are not just seeing strikes, we are seeing a strategy that operates at multiple levels at once: military, economic, political, psychological. And in doing so, it reflects a broader truth about modern conflict, that wars today are no longer confined to battlefields. They unfold across systems, across economies, across perceptions, and across entire regions. And the real challenge is not just how to strike, but how to manage the consequences of those strikes once they begin to spread. Because in the end, the most important question is not where the next strike will land, it's how far the effects will go, and whether at some point the system itself begins to respond in ways that no one can fully control. If missile strikes and geographic targeting tell us about Iran's direct capabilities, then proxy warfare tells us something even more important: its reach. Because one of the defining features of Iran's strategic approach is that it doesn't rely solely on its own military assets to project power. Instead, it operates through a network of aligned groups across the region, what we often call proxy networks. And these networks fundamentally change the nature of conflict, because now when we look at retaliation, we are no longer looking at a single chain of command, a single battlefield, or even a single country. We are looking at a distributed system of influence, one that allows Iran to extend its reach into multiple theaters without always acting directly. And that matters, because it complicates the calculations for its adversaries, particularly the United States and Israel. If Iran were to rely only on direct strikes, its actions would be more predictable, easier to trace, easier to attribute. But by leveraging proxy groups, militias, aligned organizations, and regional partners, it introduces layers of ambiguity into the system. And ambiguity in conflict is a form of power, because when responsibility is unclear, response becomes more complicated. Now, let's step back and think about what these proxy networks actually do. They allow Iran to project influence in places where it might not want or be able to act directly. Countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and even beyond have long been part of this broader strategic landscape. In these regions, Iran-aligned groups can engage in actions that reinforce Iran's objectives without necessarily triggering the same level of direct retaliation that an overt Iranian strike might provoke. This creates a kind of strategic buffer, a layer of separation between intent and action. And that separation gives Iran flexibility, because it allows the state to maintain plausible deniability, at least to some degree, while still influencing outcomes on the ground. But more importantly, it allows for continuity. Even if direct operations are disrupted, the network remains. Even if one node is weakened, others can still function. That's the power of a distributed system. It's resilient, and resilience in conflict is often more important than raw strength. Now, when we look at Aristi, sa Yorubuich or Sakin and Wurisans, so yeah, through this lens, something becomes clear. Retaliation is not limited to immediate strikes. It's part of a broader ecosystem of pressure. So while missiles and drones deliver visible kinetic effects, proxy networks sustain pressure over time. They create ongoing friction, ongoing uncertainty, ongoing instability, and that sustained pressure can be just as strategically significant as any single strike, because it forces adversaries to remain constantly engaged, to allocate resources not just to one front, but to many, to respond not just to visible threats, but to potential ones as well. And that changes the nature of defense. It transforms it from a reactive posture into a kind of continuous multi-front challenge. But there's another layer here that we shouldn't ignore: psychological warfare, because proxy activity is not just about physical effects. It's also about perception. When attacks occur in different places at different times, often without clear attribution, they create a sense of unpredictability. And unpredictability breeds uncertainty. And uncertainty over time can erode confidence. Confidence in security systems, confidence in deterrence, confidence in control. And once that confidence begins to weaken, the entire system becomes more fragile. That's why proxy networks are so effective. They don't just create physical pressure, they create psychological pressure. They keep adversaries guessing, they force them to prepare for multiple scenarios at once, and they make it harder to draw clear lines between different levels of escalation. Now, from Iran's perspective, this approach also serves a strategic purpose. It allows escalation without immediate centralization, meaning not every action needs to come directly from Tehran to have strategic impact. That's a powerful capability, because it allows the state to modulate intensity, to apply pressure incrementally, and to maintain strategic ambiguity while still achieving meaningful outcomes. But like all strategies, this one has trade-offs, because while proxy networks provide flexibility and deniability, they also introduce risk. They can act independently. They can escalate situations beyond what was originally intended, and they can become difficult to control once activated. So there is always a balance between influence and control. And that balance is not always stable, because the more you rely on distributed networks, the more you depend on alignment. And alignment in a decentralized system is never guaranteed. Now, there is also an important geopolitical implication here. Proxy networks extend conflict without necessarily resolving it. They allow tensions to persist even when direct engagement slows down. And that means that even if the primary actors reduce their level of direct confrontation, instability can continue at the periphery. In that sense, proxy warfare can act as a kind of pressure valve, but also as a source of prolonged tension. And that prolonged tension is important because it keeps the conflict alive. Even when it is not at its most visible or intense point, it maintains leverage, it preserves options, and it ensures that the underlying issues remain unresolved. But that also means that the conflict becomes harder to fully de-escalate, because now there are more actors involved, more interests at stake, more moving parts, and more opportunities for miscalculation. So when we look at Iran's use of proxy networks in response to Operation Lion's Roar, we are not just seeing a tactical decision. We are seeing a structural feature of its strategy, a way of extending influence, a way of managing risk, and a way of sustaining pressure across a broader system. But we are also seeing the limits of that approach, because in a system this complex, control becomes increasingly difficult. And once control begins to slip, the potential for unintended consequences increases. So the real question is not just how effective proxy warfare is, it's whether it can be contained, whether the actors involved can maintain alignment, and whether the system itself can absorb the pressure without breaking down. Because once that system begins to fracture, the consequences are no longer confined to one region. They begin to ripple outward, and that is where the real risk lies, not just in the actions themselves, but in the system that those actions activate. And in a world like this, the most important question becomes, can we still control the networks we create, or are we entering an era where those networks begin to control us?